Hello,
Hi.
and welcome to another edition of Story World Explorers, where we're exploring the story world of Paratexts.
That's right. We had fandom studies expert Jonathan Gray on the podcast today talking about Paratext. Those little pieces of content that float around are larger pieces of content that give it a lot of context as to what our opinions are about them.
Yeah, and Paratext also includes all canonical and not canonical texts. So that includes fan fiction, that includes advertisements, merchandise, everything that surrounds that content that you can explore with and, interact with.
That's right. So we talked about a lot of really cool stuff from the transmedia perspective and the individual artist who wants to create their own story world and how to use these paratexts to build an audience base and build fandom interest. It's a great conversation. It's coming up right after this, and away we go. All right, so we're back on another episode of Story World Explorers. Today we are talking not about a story world, but another expert in the transmedia space with Jonathan Gray. And we're going to be talking about something called Paratexts. Jonathan, I really read or got introduced to your work via the fandom studies. I went on like a 2-month bender of just reading every fandom's buddies studies book that I could find. And your name kept popping up, and so then I ended up purchasing Show Sold Separately, which was just a great manuscript of what paratexts are, how they're used, and kind of the importance of having these concepts for a transmedia story world. And so I was like, hey, I'm going to reach out to him, and here we are. So why don't you give us a little background as to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks guys for having me on. My name is Jonathan Gray. I'm a professor of media cultural studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison. But I guess a lot of the research I do is really about how media audiences and media sort of texts or content interact with each other, particularly around entertainment. I'm really interested in examining ways in which entertainment matters, how it matters, and how it works. Like there are people in my field who really like to study the sort of the aesthetics of products, like what makes them beautiful, shot changes, stuff like that. There are other people who are really into like effects, like what does this do to the audience? I'm interested in that moment when the two sort of come together, where the audience and the content, and sort of how do they interact with each other. And that really got me into studying on one hand a sort of the interest of audiences and fans, and on the other hand, that really got me down the road of thinking about paratext, because, as I said, if I ask that question of how do these things interact with each other, so often it's paratexts kind of play the matchmaker. They're sort of, easing the social interaction, introducing one to the other.
Right. So and that was really prevalent in Show Sold Separately, and why I was like, oh, this is somebody I'll reach out to. There are plenty of other authors and fandom studies that I was like, oh yeah, but like this, you really stuck out because it was really focused on that mesh point, and it's something that transmedia minds, I know, and I express this to you often when you're talking to them. They go like, oh yeah, the audience will come. We just need to build this really great thing. And then when I was reading fandom studies, it was always about like, oh well, the audience is doing all this great stuff, but there wasn't a lot on like what was on the producing side and why they were doing the things that they were doing. So this mesh point, I think, is really, really important, especially as we come to kind of a head here with content and individual artists now being able to find so many great distribution avenues where they don't need to, have, $100 million Netflix deal in order to get their things viewed and to build an audience. And we've seen plenty of examples. So let's dive into the nomenclature, is that the right word? Verbiage of
Jargon.
of fandom studies.
Jargon, yeah.
The jargon, the stuff, so that we're talking all the same language. So kind of define what a text is, and then what a paratext is in this context.
Yeah, so I mean, in media studies, text has often just been used. Like when you hear that, you probably think of a book. That's where most people use it. But the idea is that it's used to think of anything that you can read in the same way, that you can interpret, that you could try to sort of have an interaction with, that exists as some kind of like a sociological entity that, like, sort of it's a thing out there in the world, and that that's how we then often use the word text. Paratext then are all those things that sort of we probably wouldn't assume or think are officially part of the text, but
Right.
they sort of um, I mean, I'm doing this because they're on the outside of the text in many cases, but they insert themselves into it. And so, I mean, all sorts of examples. There's official paratexts, like the poster for a movie, or the trailer for a movie, or the website. There's also things that come afterwards, like the merchandise, the sort of spin-off games, the spin-off, board games, all those things. They're also fan created paratexts. So, if fans
Right.
create fan film, or if fans, reviews are also, whether they're
Right.
positive or negative. Basically, all that stuff that sort of we wouldn't see, like if I'm saying to you, hey, have you seen The Godfather? You wouldn't think it requires that you've seen all that. But that, if you did watch The Godfather, chances are you interacted with some of that. And so the interest, like conceptually with paratext, is realizing that rather than them being just kind of, inconsequential on the side, or just mere hype, just advertising, they actually do really important work to create the text for us, to because they're the
Right.
things that we nearly always encounter first. They're the things that start to tell us, like, what genre this is, who the
Right.
characters are. They set expectations. They tell us the kind of things we might want to engage with. They set the rules for the text. And so that's
Right.
my interest in paratext, is what are all those things that actually kind of negotiate the entire interaction almost before it happens in some cases.
Right. Yeah, and we were talking about how you can have an opinion on a film or a book or something without ever interacting with it, because of these paratexts that exist. And like you said, like they're the official ones, right? We were kind of ragging on Twilight during our pre-podcast conversation, where there was so much out there about what the books were when they were going to do the recreation of or the adaptation into the films, that anybody, like everybody had an opinion on it. I couldn't tell you Team Edward or Team Wright, but I knew enough. I never saw the films, I never read the books, but because of all the conversations that were happening, the fan made stuff and the official stuff that was coming out, we could be just kind of craft this. Would I go see this movie? Right?
Yeah. No, I mean, so there are kind of two ways I think of this. One is, as you said, the interesting case points that show us why paratexts matter. One is when you declare that you hate something, or that you have no interest in it, but you haven't actually watched it. Now, that might seem
Right.
like a contradiction in terms, and it's certainly, some fans get upset when someone says, I hate your show, but I've never seen it. But if we, and we all do it, the question is then, how do we have a sense in the first place of what that show was? How do, if we know enough to know we don't like it, where do we find that information out?
Right.
Um, the other interesting case point, I'll give you an example. It's a fun one of a friend of mine who, when the Star Wars, episode 7, 8, and 9 came out, he really hates spoilers, and he was adamant that he just wanted to avoid any kind of spoilers. And as we got closer to the date, the poor guy had to live like a monk. Like, we all started telling him, like, you can't go to Target because Target had, like, BB-8 oranges. He would literally, if he was sitting in a theater and he saw the Lucasfilm, on the screen, he'd have to run out because he couldn't watch a trailer. And he ended up saying, like, he just couldn't do it for the next film because there is so much messaging about Force Awakens out there, that to
Right.
avoid it all required him to basically, sort of deplug from society, which again shows us that for the rest of us, by the time we sat down and we saw Lucasfilm as it was opening with Force Awakens, we'd already been given so much information about what this movie was. We already had so many expectations. We had things that we
Right.
knew were going to be in it. We were interacting with it. Or I'm saying there were other people who had seen all that and thought, nah, not my thing.
Right. Right. Right.
And I'm even thinking, like, the power of memes, and, like, with, because I was just watching The Bear, and I got to the scene where I had seen this meme play out like 100 times, and I always thought it was funny, and now it's like, now that it's in the show, I almost disassociated it from the show. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, it was almost like, oh, that's the meme. It's like, no, this is where it came from.
Right.
You know, and it's like, but then again, but now it's like almost there's like, if the show is, or if a movie has been out there for a long time, the most iconic things that are going to happen in those movies are going to be made into those things, and you might spoil something that's not even supposed to be a spoiler. You know what I mean? Like, someone
Yeah.
might, the way Walter White dies, you know, it's a meme, and yet you're like, oh, is that even a part of the show? And then you see, and like, oh, I've seen this collapse like 100 times,
Right.
and I already, so almost, not that it ruins it, but it almost takes away the context for it and creates its own context with still being a part of the thing that with the material being the same. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, that's a
Sure.
really
I
important
mean,
part
you've also
of
got these
yeah.
you got these weird cases, right, where sometimes the trailer includes things that don't make it into the movie. I mean, prominently, the music in a trailer is rarely in the movie. It's nearly always Salisbury Hill or one of the same like 4 songs. Um, but also, like, I remember way back when like Phantom Menace was coming out, one of the key I'm blanking on what it was, but one of the key lines from the trailer was by Darth Maul, and that was never even in the movie. So, sometimes you get the stuff that it's there really just to kind of create a vibe, and it might not actually be in the film itself.
Right. Yeah, and back to like what we were just saying, the like when I was watching I won't go down Lord of the Rings. We'll talk about Nicolas Cage, which is a fan favorite of Jack and mine. Rewatching National Treasure, and the line "I'm going to steal the Declaration of Independence" has been used in so many memes that I mean, it happened, and it was almost like it was playing before me. Like, I already knew what was, like it just all these great contexts of pop culture, of social media, of all these things that are kind of illustrating, right? I almost was watching the movie for that reference, right? Just to see it again, right? Because I don't even really remember when we saw it in theaters 1,000 years ago of even laughing at that line, but now it's so prevalent. And that's really the power. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, you didn't want to talk about Lord of the Rings, but I'll throw a quick example in there.
Go ahead.
My Facebook has given me, I don't know if this is just a thing right now or it's just a thing for me, but Facebook has given me a lot of memes around Faramir, around, the whole dynamic of like Boromir would have brought me this, and that Faramir, and it's really like, I feel so sorry for poor Faramir. Every day he's being like beaten up on my Facebook feed. And I think about this in terms of like Paratext. Imagine you'd never seen Lord of the Rings, like, and yet interacting with this meme. You would then go to the movies with a sense of like that is what Faramir is. He's just like the loser brother. Which I actually think he's not. But like if framing you could be given, and then it might actually take you like a lot of dialogue to actually get somewhere else with him. So it's that power that Paratexts have to actually kind of determine how we're going to interact with stories.
Right.
Well, I mean, going back to the Nicolas Cage thing, it's like that's now all of a sudden a punchline, where in the movie when it was originally crafted, that was a oh shit line.
Right.
That wasn't supposed to be like, me at 5 a.m. like, with a bowl of cereal, I'm going to steal the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is the way it's being used now. So Paratexts are like these outside of the actual text, but gives such context to, and we'll try to fit as much text words either as a prefix or a postfix. What is it? Suffix. As a suffix as we can. Right. It gives context to what these of what your opinion is, whether before you watch it or even after. Right. Something can have a totally different meaning after the fact based on what other people are using. We've been using memes as an example, but reviews and other things, and everybody who's listening to this podcast has experienced this in one way or the other. So we have the official Paratexts, the ones that are being produced by the the entertainment entity to help either market or get more interaction around their IP. When we talk about transmedia, Paratexts are hugely important of fleshing out this world to make it feel like it's actually lived in, right? Like, it's like, oh, I could step into this and play around with some things, And it doesn't just exist only because of the movie, right? I don't have to keep rewatching the movie. There's all this other stuff I can interact with.
Yeah.
And then outside of that, right, it's what are the fans going to do? Fandom studies focuses a lot on fan text, which are paratext of text, right? Where these fans are so engrossed in this story and so engrossed in this this world that they need to go back, right? They're compelled to go back, and they start creating their own stuff. To which some fans might enjoy that more than the actual official text themselves. So I think that let's do some real world examples. We've been floating out some examples, but we were talking about the Simpsons Hit and Run, but then you were like, I could probably come up with some more recent ones. Although Hit and Run is a very important part of our lives growing up watching the Simpsons and playing that game. But what are some examples just out there right now that people can just kind of jump into paratext wise that has that have all of this stuff kind of floating around that maybe will open up some, oh yeah, that's right, oh okay, I get it now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I promise I'll answer the question, but at first I would just note, one of the things that's fun when you start to look at paratext, right, is that it's really easy to talk about them as existing before, after, and using those words of before, after. But what it starts to challenge you to do is realize, before, after what? You start to realize maybe they are part of the thing. I mean, that's really obvious with TV, where classic TV, right? You'd watch an episode, go away for a week, you might see some paratext. They might make you rethink things. You go back, continue. But then you start to realize that's what happens with even with something like a movie or a book that you think there's a before and after. If it's living out there in culture, if it's a part of popular culture, there is kind of no after. It's all the thing itself. And so, right. I mean, the example I'd give right now that's classic for this is it's the Superman movie. I mean, there's this whole paratextual battle about whether Superman is, a woke warrior, and therefore you've got, a whole bunch of people who probably otherwise might not have cared one way or the other, who are either now adamant they're not going to watch this because they've heard it's lefty nonsense, or are yep, sign me up, I'm into it. I never cared, which I find that side particularly interesting. Superman as a sort of defender of the American way might seem seemed like he's dripping with a little too much patriotism for some people on the left, for instance, who now are saying oh, this is an immigrant story, cool, let's do this. But over and above what those ads are saying, you also of course have all these people who are coming to this movie with a long history of Superman, and some of that is from the movies, some of it's from the comic books, but some of it is also from the idea that Superman is an immigrant story is something that fans have long interacted with. There's a lot of fan fiction out there that deals with the fact that Superman is an illegal alien and that there's something productive to deal with there. So anyone who's ever read those stories or written those stories is already thinking in those terms. And then there's so many other ways in which, some of the people who are offended by this version of Superman is because they've engaged with other paratexts in which Superman is sort of, a badass conservative warrior, and they don't get why that would happen. And so there's all these sort of obstacles that paratexts create that sort of, I mean, one of the frames I use in the book is to think about refraction, right? That sort of an arc of light comes into something and hits something and it goes off in another direction. And paratexts are constantly refracting how we interact with things.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's an interesting, or that's a really good way of describing it. Because at a certain point, right, you have no ability to kind of control what that narrative is. And it's not that, of course, the DCU was oh yeah, well, or Warner Brothers was we don't know what this is going to do. All right, as soon as we start talking about it, it'd be a immigration story. But it was one of those things that, because they were framing it as such, through the paratext, that they knew it was going to shoot up everybody was going to be talking about it on either side, either for or against. And the old adage that all publicity is good publicity, right? Or there's no bad publicity, really rings true in this instance, because they're talking about restarting the DCU because of how well it did, right? I mean, it has done so well that this defunct garbage universe of just like a Suicide Squad and 5 different Batmans and what the hell's
Yeah.
going on trying to chase Marvel is now has a solid footing of, okay, so now we can build off of this
Yeah.
into something.
And from the studio's perspective, all they probably care about is that people talking about it. It's a thing.
Yeah.
Right.
People are buying tickets as a result. But what's interesting, like when we talk about things like refraction, is that means that like that's again why paratexts matter, is because on one level it might seem you look at something like Superman. What can I do, to like impact how people make sense of Superman? And there is an answer to that, which is create paratext. Like
Right.
the paratexts are out there. They're ways of trying to encourage people to see it this way rather than that way. I mean, I used to love the era of like DVD bonus tracks and so forth, because you get so much material where like the producers themselves, like the director would be trying to tell you, no, see it this way. The actor trying to tell you, no, see it this way. Like there's a cool moment going back to Lord of the Rings where Ian McKellen talks about this moment where Sam and Frodo hold hands. And in the cast commentary track, he's talking about how it was important for viewers who might have seen Sam and Frodo as having like a queered relationship. And he's being quite tedious there, right? He's encouraging you, like, please. He's not just saying you could see it this way. He's saying maybe you want to see it this way. And of course, he outs himself in doing that. By outing himself, he potentially invites you to queer Gandalf himself. And so it's this interesting sort of moment where one of the people on the side of production is encouraging you to see it these different ways. But then fans can play the same game. We can create all sorts of paratexts that encourage others to see it our way. It's a sort of battle, if you will.
Yeah. So we talk about the, we're very high up on the independent artist scene and creating these worlds. And like we were saying during our pre-podcast conversation, we run into, individuals that have these mega projects, right? Like they're like, we're making a feature-length film and it's going to take X amount of days, right? Or X amount of weeks and this amount of money. And they're just kind of like barreling through. I want to talk a little bit about how Paratext can help build, either reframe a question, right? We were talking about during our pre-podcast conversation about how dance has a certain like barrier around it, right? Of people like, who goes to see dance? Well, I don't understand dance, right? And that's because of the Paratext outside, right? And you go to, if you think about even Frasier, right? One of our favorite shows, and how they describe opera, right? It's like, how could we go and see opera? I don't know, like, they're talking about the singers, the language, the stories.
There's a certain level of intelligence and refinement that has to go into it. It's the same thing with plays too. A lot of people don't want to go see plays because they don't know, like, am I going to know when to clap? Am I going to be allowed to react? It's like
concerts as well, right?
People are going to mock me if I get it wrong. Are people going to
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot like within Paratext that when we're talking to right now, what happens on social media for the most part, when you talk to independent artists, right? I don't care what medium they're working in. On social media, they're doing come to my show, right? That's what it boils down to. Or look at us rehearse, right? And what they're missing is any sort of dialogue or any sort of trying to reframe what they're doing, right? And show like, hey, this is an opportunity, like you could enjoy this as well, right? I can alter these conversations about dance, about theater, about opera, about independent film, right? How many people are going to go out of their way to go see an independent film at at the Music Box or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about like that, like how we've talked about how Paratext can reform conversations and make opinions without even interacting with the main piece. So let's talk a little bit about the Paratext from the side of the independent artist. How much opportunity is out there for them to start to reform some of the narratives around their own projects? So I feel like there's a ton of opportunity.
Yeah, two things come to mind. One is, which is I tell my students who want to be creators often, is like, don't like skimp on the creating of Paratext. Like I think a lot of times, fair enough, from my own perspective, sometimes I write a book and then I'm done. Like, and then the press says like, do you have ideas of the cover? And I'm like, no, man, I'm tired. And then they're like, could you advertise this thing? And I'm like, oh, I'm so tired. I just wrote this book. But
Right.
similarly, like, if you're making whatever you're making, like realize that those trailers are going to matter. The posters matter. And that you can either let someone else create them who doesn't understand what you're doing, who might not
Right.
understand the vision, or you can see them as a kind of extension of what you're doing. You can realize that like those are all the paratexts are places to play, to
Right.
continue thinking about like what are you authoring, like, and they can be challenges like what is the context I want people to have for this. How do I want them to see this? Think about like the famous example of the Blair Witch Project,
Right.
which was not a big budget project, and yet it is the sort of ship that sailed the face that sailed 1,000 ships in terms of like transmedia. Why is because the advertising set a context and it contributed to it. It invited people and users into play. And that really gets the second thing is to realize that like at the end of the day, there's so many texts out there, and there are some people who just want to read a story, see something done. But
Right.
a lot of us, what's going to make us stop is things that we can really get our hands on, and things that we're
Right.
perhaps invited to like play along. And so,
Right.
one thing is to think about the paratexts sometimes are the places in which you can allow, engage, invite, play. And you can still have your absolute singular vision for the project itself, and you don't have to compromise on that. But the paratext can be where you sort of open up other doors for people to sort of explore this character or to think about this
Right.
context. And in doing that, you can be doing both of those things. You can be kind of like framing how you want people to interact while also respecting that they want to interact, which also means it can be like research and development, right? If you
Correct.
look at how they're
Right.
interacting with it and you're smart, you realize, oh, that's what they want, not
Right.
perhaps what I'm giving them. Or maybe I can do both. Like they really want this, and this is what matters to the fans, to the users. Maybe I can do both.
Right. Yeah. Such great points because, and on top of that as well, right, and that you were alluding to this in both points is you can meet people where they're at, right? So like you said, like exploring a character, right? I, so many times on this podcast, if we talked about like, oh, just do like a ship log or
Yeah.
something, right? Something within this context to kind of get people like, all right, it's not a heavy lift,
Yeah.
right? If you're interested, if this setting or whatever interests you, and you know, like a weekly email comes in and it's like, hey, this is what's happening in this man's mind, right?
Yeah.
His daily things.
And then, it's often like what we've been trying to suggest is almost kind of create these paratexts while you're creating the other thing to kind of,
Yeah.
it's like to prime the audience. Like, I mean,
Right.
before you turn on the light, you're going to have to make sure that the gas is flowing or there's a spark. Otherwise, nothing's going to catch. You could just
Everybody dies. Everybody dies of carbon monoxide.
Right. It's like, if you're going to, if you just post that, if you work so hard on that book, say, and it's just like gas flying into the room, and it's like, no, there's no fire, because you haven't sparked anybody's interest.
Right.
It doesn't matter matter how flammable the gas is.
Right.
There's no spark.
Right.
So kind of building that, whetting that appetite to be like, oh, something big is happening, something is going to catch.
Yeah.
Is important, especially when we're talking about, the good thing about the decentralization of production and attention is that anybody can try, but now there's no one way to do it,
Right.
So, it's not, pump, X amount of dollars into something because there's only 3 production companies that are doing things, so everyone's going to watch it. Now you have to work your audience, you have to build your context so that it can support,
Build the trust up too, right? Of like,
right.
Listen, I'm going to want to engage.
Right, it's like you're saying like this with the paratext, and it's like it surrounds it, but it also supports the text itself.
Yeah.
And now you have to build that support before you can build the thing. Whereas
Right.
it used to be the opposite way. You had to build the thing in order to have other people support it. Now you have to
Sure.
support it to build it.
And sometimes too, you could also think about like I think some of the smarter creators will challenge themselves to like how can I invite in the like how can I show audiences that they're allowed to play?
Right.
And like I think of um, way earlier in my career, I met Damon Lindelof at this thing, one of the writers of Lost and Leftovers and Watchmen. And we totally geeked out about transmedia. And he
Yeah.
was talking about, like for him, because I said, you really care about it. Like this at this point, he was writing Lost, and Lost was one of the few shows on TV that really, really cared about transmedia and
Yeah.
paratext, stuff like that. And I said, where'd that come from? And he said, man, I'm a kid of Star Wars. Like I grew up with, like we all wanted to know more about Boba Fett, and like Boba Fett has
Right.
next to no lines, and
Right.
yet we're all fascinated with him. And then if you think of the Lindelof said that, and if you watch Lost, you see Lost was one of the first big shows that really showed an interest in like everyone. Like you get backstories from like so many people, which
Yeah.
really is kind of like the equivalent of, hey, what about that Boba Fett? And
Right.
what you're doing by doing that as a creator is you're also signaling to the fans like, hey, this is that type of show. Like, please, like I've given the backstory of this, but there are red shirts on the island. Tell those stories. Like,
Right.
what are their stories? And so there's
Right.
some ways that sometimes you can sort of cue from the outset that like this is the world that I'm invested in, and go ahead, play.
Right. And I have a voice in it, right? And I have some sort of way of getting my hands into clay.
Yeah.
And when we talk about transmedia with these creators too, it's like it's a little daunting because it's like, oh, I have no audience. Who's going to actually interact with X, Y, and Z, right? And the key to transmedia, at least the way that we talk about it with the low budget stuff, is you gotta try things and see what kind of starts to stick. And like you said in your 2 points, like how they interact, they're going to tell you what they're looking for the things that you're working on, and you can start to kind of guide the ship, right? We One of the things that we get told is like people that don't want to is like, I don't want to change my creative vision for what the audience wants. And it's like, no, it's not that. It's literally like we're in a conversation. It's a regenerative conversation going back and forth. Like you're talking to me and I'm listening and I'm like, oh, that's a great point. I don't like that because that doesn't fit with, but this we're going to expand on, and then you offer it back. And when you create these paratexts, you have to look at them as conversations you're starting. Right? You're
Yeah.
starting conversations with your audience and seeing, hey, is there any response back? Um, yeah, I think that, I mean, there's just such opportunity, especially when we sit back and from the independent creator, for the independent artist, of like, what are you competent in doing, right? Don't try to make an animated, short for TikTok if you can't do that, right?
Yeah.
But if you're a writer or if you can do that, right, that's how you can start to piecemeal out these paratexts that are going to be not easy. I'm not going to say easy, right? Because everything takes time, but more simple to do that you can get out on a regular basis to continue that conversation. And the longer time that you have that conversation going, you're building, like, again, like the surrounding, the structure for the larger projects that you ultimately want to do. And we know that if you really want funding for something, you need to have an audience for it, right? You
Yeah.
need to have, they're looking to mitigate their risk. So any which way, Paratext is a great way to test and validate that there is an audience for your larger projects.
Yeah, and really a space then, realizing that like people want to invest in their stories. I mean,
Right.
the Kickstarter is a great example here. In fact, so Ivan Asquith is a really great creator of transmedia. He practically ran Lucasfilm's transmedia before it was sold to Disney, and
Yeah.
it's relevant to me that like he has this background in all this like traditional transmedia, and then the next arc of his career was he was behind like the Veronica Mars Kickstarter and the MST 3000 like Kickstarter, and that actually makes sense if you think about it. The Kickstarter is ultimately about allowing people investment in your product, and that's what transmedia is finding
Yeah.
ways to say like, I know that you want to care about this, or
Right.
hey, this is a text that I'm going to let you play with, and I'm going to respect that play.
Right.
And I think, and as you said, sometimes the creators, they've got a singular vision, but what's great about Paratext is that can be where you can let people play around. You can still do
Right.
what the heck you want in
Yeah.
the sort of the mothership, but it's all the things around that perhaps might like open the doors to other people to play.
Are we going to go on a rant about Kickstarter? Because that's a great rant. Because the amount of people that, well, our father was one of them, who thought that if you were just to post something on Kickstarter, people would invest in it. And it's like, no, that's not
Yeah.
how that works, right? They're not just people out there like, I have millions of dollars. I would like to invest in the first thing that pops up on Kickstarter, right?
No one goes searching for things to invest in
Correct.
on Kickstarter.
Right.
They are brought to Kickstarter. You know, it's
Right.
like
by something that they were so passionate about, they
yeah.
needed to
no one's
invest.
no one's just browsing on the most recent projects to that are near their
Right.
completion percentage. It's like,
But
yeah,
also think about the things that like if you are browsing,
Right.
so like I play board games, and Kickstarter can be a great place to see like board games
Sure.
starting. Sometimes the things that are more likely intrigue me are not just like, oh, this looks like a good game, I want this, but it's that right column where it's telling you all the extra cool stuff you're going to get. Or
Sure.
then similarly, then like, why would I invest in this movie, not that one? Well, because it's promised me something sort of interesting, and often what it's
Right.
promising is some kind of like paratextual sort of engagement.
Right.
Like with the board games, you might get cooler playing pieces, or you might get
Right.
like an extra. So there's all this. The extra stuff is what gets the engagement and involvement.
Right, right. And then yeah, and proves that, or if you can get that audience going, we say that like, you gotta at least invest a good chunk of time in building that audience before you go and launch a Kickstarter. Because if nobody cares, it's just gonna sit there.
Yeah,
I mean, your mom will donate to it, right? But then that's basically it, right? Outside of your circle.
exactly.
And so getting those, like, yeah. So and this could deviate into a lot of conversations about arts organizations and fundraising. But because it's right now, right, like the idea is it's very large foundations. You go, you ask for $10,000, and they say you can only spend it on this project or only teaching children. And it's like, well, we want to do performances. It's like, well, then you got to go, like, you got to make your money there. You got to make, you have to be able to raise money from the people that love this art form and love not even just the art form, but what you're doing specifically.
Sure.
And it's all about building that audience. Once again, coming back, the paratextual context for the larger things is what's going to get people excited. It's what people are gonna really sink their teeth into. And yeah, just to reiterate, the having something that you could dig your hands into, right? Of creating something that's interactive in some which way. And there's so many different ways to make something interactive. It doesn't have to be like take a quiz, or that they're like, hey, make your own short story, right? But inviting people and an opportunity in a space where people can voice their opinions. Oh, I actually think that this is what's going on,
Yeah.
and having that not a like it's like we like to think of story worlds not having walls around them, but there is a sphere, right? Of like, when I'm in this sphere, people talk like this. This is what we all kind of agree on. I have my opinions about this, and I can get in conversations with other people.
And I mean, I empathize with. I mean, as I said, it must be hard and frustrating and tiring after you put all this other work. But I think the one thing to learn from perhaps on the industrial side is that where it works when it's big budget and MCU and Lord of the Rings and so forth is that they hire other people to do it, and or they open the door to other people to do it. And so one way to think of this is, are there people in your circle, are there people you can bring into your circle who like that'll be their thing. Like maybe they're not a sort of primarily creative, like they're interested in creating media, but they're not the one who has the story, they're not the one who's going to film it.
Right.
But maybe they're the ones who can precisely sort of really get at, like, what's the core of your, and from the outside they can look at it and maybe see things that you can't, just like good fans would.
Right.
And then they can start some of those fires so that you can do your thing and
Yeah.
them do theirs. I mean, I think that's often where good transmedia has worked, is where someone else gets involved and does it.
Right. Yeah. Well, we were talking. I mean, I was trying to write my own book, coming 2035, and I was talking to Jack about the kind of the concepts in there about treating enterprises or entertainment from an independent artist as though you were a startup, like a tech startup,
Yeah.
and testing these things and making small tests to make sure that you can have an audience. And Jack goes like, "You're asking me to write a book and do this and do this and do this," and it's like, that's too much. And it was like, really, the reason why Jack and I work is because there's two people, right? We could use a third, a fourth, and a fifth, but like, you need to like have that team around you. Find that team that can get passionate about your concept along with you, to help out with that. Because
because it's when you start talking about, because Paratext surround all canonical and not canonical versions of the story, which some of these canonical versions of the story are becoming almost too much for one person to come up with. It's like there's not enough creativity in just one mind to come up with all these things. You constantly, there's a reason why so many planets in sci-fi movies are just one biome. It's like, this is a rainforest planet. It's like, well, planet? It's like, right? This is a desert planet, and then Arctic planet. One biome. It's because one person can't come up with every type of thing for, you're coming up with kingdoms, and then you're also coming up with, oh, Jesus Christ. It's just like,
what made those kingdoms? Right?
Oh,
where are they?
You situated? Just can't, you have to hire some kind of planetary designer, to come up with the things that are happening. So it's like, yes, especially as we get further into this, as worlds become more, stories become more extensions of different worlds, you have to have a group of people that can look at it, because it was just like, we were having a conversation of a book that I wrote, and he was like, what's the point of it? What are you doing? And I'm like, I wrote it. I don't know what it, it's like, I didn't think about any of this stuff while I'm writing it. I mean, the creative process is so much, it's not, I can't imagine it like a thought process. It's just kind of coming out of you, and you kind of go with the flow, or where the idea comes from, you have no idea. And like what you're saying, having someone outside saying, hey, this could be helpful to think of it in this way, can help refine that idea.
In some ways, it's sort of the lesson of paratextuality is, once you realize that the trailers do change how people think about things, once you realize that merchandise does change how people think about things, or at least that they could, you start to realize, well, wait, does that mean like the person who creates the merchandise or the editor of the trailer is kind of like an author? And the answer is, at a small level, yes. And so like, and once you've opened that door, like it may seem a threatening door, but there can also be a fun door to go through, because what you realize is, like, you start to think about all the media out there that succeeds, and almost all of it succeeds because a group are engaged in it. Like, as much as we like to talk about singular creator figures, every singular creator figure is surrounded by lots of other people who sort of make the whole thing work. And seeing the creative enterprise as a group enterprise, I think that's entirely for the better. Like, if we get away from the idea that like one person labor,
we really do.
We really garage
do.
Or wherever,
because that's the magic of the writer's room. It's because, like, you like I went to a conference in New York, and we did like a writer's room type thing, and we all pitched our ideas, and then we came through, and then we picked one, and then we started spitballing ideas. And unless you're super egotistical, either about your ideas or your project, it's kind of hard to work with you. But if you're just, the fact that it wasn't my project, I wasn't attached to it in any way. I was hearing what the guy was saying, and I was just saying, what if this could happen? It was all a what if. What do you think of this? And it's just giving that creator the idea to be like, yes, this works. Collaboration is actually where most of the work happens on those TV shows. You have an outline, and then by episode 3 of shooting, you're like, well, this isn't going to work anymore. So you constantly have to refine.
This is the thing that you're looking for with your fans and the audience, to create the right, like, what if this was true, right? And that's what a lot of fandom texts are. That's the interaction. So if you start to think about your project, doesn't matter what it is, that ultimately the influence and where the story goes, it's authored by you, but it's authored by so many other people, right? And all these outside of your sphere audience members are going to, once again, just latch on to Boba Fett, and they're going to be like, I need to know more about this. I'm going to make stuff if you're not going to make stuff, right? They will fill that void if you don't fill that void, right? And sometimes that's what you need to have happen, and great ideas come from the outside. And so I think that a great way to kind of conclude this conversation is the idea that, paratexts are outside of something until they're not, right? They're outside of the text until they're not. The really cool stuff happens when you have this, we'll just keep using this example of the, like the captain's log of a lost ship, and you have this whole story world about this other movie that you're working on, but there's this captain's log that people latch onto, and like, wait a minute, I gotta know more, to the point where the paratext becomes the text, right? The appetizer becomes the meal. And how exciting, I'm getting goosebumps now, how exciting that is, because once again, it was a way for you to get fan interaction. And guess what? You hooked a tuna. You didn't get a mackerel. You hooked like this huge fish.
Yeah.
You're like, oh my gosh, like now I can really invest in something that the fans are looking for.
That's the Star Wars franchise to me. I saw the first movie when I was like, I could hardly walk.
Right.
But like, think about how those movies worked when they first came out. It's a wild premise. Like, try this today. Go up to like a 3-year-old, start telling them a story, and then say, "I'll come back in 3 years and tell you the next 2 hours." And then when they're like 6, say, "I'll come back in 3 years and tell you the next
Right.
2 hours." How the heck did that model work? And the answer is the toys, the Paratext, because in between those long stretches in which nothing was happening and there was no internet, so I wasn't able to read fan theories and so forth. What I was doing was playing with those toys. And so, as you said, like, if I'm honest and I tell the story of what Star Wars means to me as a child, like, the toys are actually so much more primary than the movies, because there was just 6 hours of the movies. There was like days, weeks, months, years of the toys, and that's the capacity for Paratext, right? Is, as you said, that the sort of the snack becomes the meal. That all of a sudden maybe they can carry the body of the text proper, like a bunch of little ants.
Right.
Anytime.
Yeah, and it filled the paratext that in this instance filled that void, but it also fed the hunger, right? Because there was so much like, I need more of this, and I talk a lot about attention and earning attention, and like to keep. I mean, there's so much out there vying for our attentions now, right? I mean, you need to be able to keep people interested, right? Of like, hey, by the way, we're still doing X, Y, and Z. And what happens a lot, right, to kind of fully round out, right, is you're working on this movie, nobody hears from you for 2 years, and then you come back, you're like, oh, you're still working on that, right? Yeah. And to you, you're like, I was in it the entire time. How do you mean that you're still? It's like, oh, but there was nothing to not even just tide me over. And the stories that you end up telling, or the interactions you end up having as an audience member with the paratext, that becomes like, oh, this is the real thing, it just highlights so many great opportunities for you as a creator to then make a new text that was started, the fire was started with the paratext, but now I gotta, right? And Boba Fett's a great example of that, where, now he's got a whole series, right? Where it's like, finally, like, that was like, I mean, how many years has people been asking for that? And it was like, finally, we have like something to latch on to. And there's just so much opportunity. One of the daunting things as transmedia, as we all know, is from a creator standpoint, it's like, I got to do what? I got to think about like this expansive universe off into like the distance, 1,000,000 years in the future and 1,000,000 years behind. And God, it's really daunting. But when you think of, if you start with the small little kernels, right? Oh, it's just a story about this lost ship, right? Yeah. I haven't really thought that much about it, right? All I know is that it's a ship that was lost, and this captain is trying to find his way home, or whatever, right? It's an Odysseus situation. And so it starts off as something small, and then the context is built through interaction from the fans and other ways that the story kind of meanders, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, hey, look at that, I created transmedia. I have a whole other story that happened, and I didn't need to outline it, right? I didn't have to make this crazy timeline that, once again, went 1,000,000 years either way of the main text that I'm writing, it's just such a great organic way of building out these worlds and getting fan interaction. Yeah, really cool stuff. This is
And
really
it doesn't have
important.
to, I was just going to say it doesn't all have to be in 1 year either. I mean, Star Wars is another great
Right.
example of, right,
Yeah.
like, I loved as a little kid, like the Death Star trench scene. But, where did those plans come from? Well, go several decades in the future and we're going to get Rogue One. Tell me more. Now we get Andor, like some of
Right.
it doesn't all have to be done at once. Sometimes, again, it might seem
Yeah.
daunting, but
Right.
if
Well,
it
I mean,
works, you've always got
yeah.
extra time to tell more of the story.
Right. And I mean, it was, the throwaway line, "I knew your father during the Clone Wars." Like, I don't think George Lucas knew anything about what that meant. He's like, "Clone Wars sounds fucking cool,"
Yeah, right.
And he said, "I'm gonna have this old wizard say it," and it's like, "Yes, I knew your father during the Clone Wars," and
Yeah.
how many animated series, how many movies were built off of that one throwaway line? Like there was a point where Lucasfilms gave the Clone Wars were just kind of like, hey, writers, like I think it was like books were written on this, and no one had any context to what the timeline, how long it was, how far in the past it was, and then when George Lucas finally decided, I'm going to make something, I'm going to actually anchor this somewhere, it kind of made all those books seem like they were talking out of left field.
Right.
So it's like a little bit of planning would be pretty helpful, or at least he could have read some of the books before he decided.
Right, and then been like, hey, I really like this perspective, right? And including that, the fandom. I mean, could you imagine as a fan, and you're like, I wrote something on the Clone Wars, and Lucas was like, you know what, 95% right, and you're like, what?
But what's great is some of it can be responsive. Like
right.
why was there a whole TV series about the Mandalorian? And then also even about Boba Fett, just because like the fan base decided that Mandalorians are cool, and like
yeah, right.
In Andor, I mean, like I don't know whether we will get it, but I think the fans like Clea and Luthen enough that like if I was at Lucasfilm right now and you were telling me like what's the next big thing, I'm like, let's tell their story. And
sure.
Could you have guessed that? Not necessarily. So it can be very responsive too. You can sort of play with.
Yeah.
What are the stories?
Well, yeah, that's the exploration of it all. That's the you're exploring because you don't know what character is gonna latch onto the audience. It's just like the first scene of the first season of Breaking Bad. Jesse Pinkman was supposed to die, and then they found out it's like we can't kill him. He's from the artist's perspective, he's growing into a character you never thought he could. But then also from the audience, it's like this is one of their favorite characters. So you can't just end them unceremoniously, So you have to explore that character, just like the characters that are coming off that deserve their own spin-off or deserve their own backstories.
Right.
Will kind of, the cream comes to the top.
Yeah.
I mean, for me,
right. Or what? Yeah.
For me, a fascinating creator figure here is Matt Groening from The Simpsons, because by all accounts, Matt Groening hasn't written or pinned The Simpsons in any way for many, many, many years. But one of the key things he does is he manages the Paratext, like he manages the licenses. And actually, that's one of the realms in which The Simpsons has been really successful. As we talked about, Hit and Run was really smart. The Simpsons game was smart. A lot of their they're officially licensed. There's lots of unofficial stuff too, but a lot of their officially licensed merchandise is really fun and develops that kind of like, tongue-in-cheek, kind of rude, erotic, satiric sensibility. And no surprise, like their primary creative figure, that's all he's doing. He's not in the writing room. He's not in, drawing. What he's doing is managing the toys and actually doing quite a good job of it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so, and yeah, that's a great example because, I mean, how do you have a TV show that's been running for, is it 35 years? It's 89.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's close to, 35 years. That's crazy. That's absolutely nuts. And it's not just because of, I mean, we grew up with the 90s, early 2000s Simpsons, so those are, of course, the funniest. We have not watched anything recent. But what it became as like this cultural icon, right? What was it that the author Homer was the most famous Homer for like what 2,000 years, and you would never have thought that there would be a Homer to supplant him, right?
Yeah.
Like just out of nowhere, and a total dope at that too. That nobody would ever name their kid Homer after, right? It's like, how could you? Like you're naming it after the Simpsons, the guy who doesn't, barely graduated high school. Or didn't actually graduate high school. I think that was in one of the episodes.
No, I could talk about The Simpsons all day. I mean, I'll just quickly say one of the things, The Simpsons is a great example for Paratext, right? Because it has so much merchandise around it, but also because in its very early days, it had a sort of weird moment of characterization, which is when George, H.W. Bush was like campaigning for re-election, and he said, we need a nation closer to the Waltons and further from the Simpsons. And all of a sudden, like, he created this little paratext that like convinced people that The Simpsons was like a lefty thing. And I think The Simpsons, if you look at it, it's kind of rude and like anti-authority, but not necessarily left, not necessarily right. But at that moment, he made it that for all sorts of conservatives. I mean, I had a generation or two of students who, if their parents were conservative, they weren't allowed to watch The Simpsons. And on the other hand, the lefties grew up believing like this was their champion text because like Bush didn't like it. And so like the idea that The Simpsons is this sort of like lefty darling text, some of that really just comes from this one little weird moment where, Bush thought it was good to campaign against a sitcom.
And then they had that episode where he moved in across the street.
Yeah, exactly.
And it was a perfect response, and he moved because he couldn't stand him, right? Because Homer and Bart were...
Although even before that, there's a moment where Bart's laying on the floor and watches, and they do the live action version of Bush saying this. And he goes, "Hey man, we're all just struggling to get through this recession." And it was just like a nice, quick response that like, focus on the economics, buddy.
Anyway. So this has been a great conversation. We're coming up on an hour here. I hope that people listening have learned a little bit of something and inspired that, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be this huge burden of transmedia, of creating all these things, because of Paratext, we're trying to engage with our audience in very small, manageable ways, and then also contextualize what we're working on, right? And get people interested in what we're working on. And maybe change some minds about, dance and opera based on how you can have that conversation of like, no, like this isn't something that you need a PhD to understand, or like this is as fun as...
Or just invite them in by like unveiling the curtains, like, psst, this is what you should look for.
Right.
Like, this is how you look real smart. This is how you look real smart.
Yeah, right.
Say these words in this order, or splice these up.
Actually, you know what? I'm going to bring The Simpsons back in because I think The Simpsons has done one of the keys to his success is like, I do audience studies, and so I've asked lots of people on projects on The Simpsons, what do you like about The Simpsons? And the thing almost everyone says about The Simpsons is that it has two levels. It has a level for like the dumb people, like Barney burping and so forth, and it has the smart level, and everyone thinks they are on the smart level. Like even idiots think that they're on the smart level, and I think there's something to learn for that. That like I've always thought that like that's a great dynamic that like producers should do. If you can convince everyone that your show has like two levels, but that everyone's in on it, then they're all part of the cool kids group. Like even the
Right. Yeah, because that's the big thing that, especially in the high cultured arts, which I read a whole history of the opera, and it started off. It was like aristocrats weren't going to see the opera. This was for the plebs and the that. It was not a high art at the time, and how it became that, right? And it's just so absolutely so crazy. But of being like, hey, I'm in on. Like, I understand, right? And that's a big thing of feeling like you can belong. But that's a whole other conversation with Paratext of getting audiences to feel like they belong and they're in on something. We could talk about that all day. We usually end off, back in the day when we used to do more interviews just like this, we would ask any final thoughts, anything that you want the listeners to kind of take away from our conversation. Anything come to mind thoughts-wise?
I think the thing would just be, if you're a creator, like realize that there's so much room for like fun and play here. Like it doesn't have to be imposing. And then if you're thinking about this as a consumer, like again, this is the place where you can sort of put your imprint on things. Like there's all sorts of
Right.
fan activism that has surrounded things that's taken place paratextually. Like, Star Wars, there was a real battle around the toys and who should be in the toys, like the where is
Sure.
Ray hashtag and so forth. And that was all just a way of, again, like fans were able to sort of like imprint something, direct something, refract it in
Yeah.
a different way. And so, regardless of whether you're a creator or a consumer, like the paratexts actually can be a key part of your arsenal.
Excellent. Well, great. Once again, thanks so much for jumping on. Thanks for responding to my email with the
Sure,
first
yeah, no,
email that
thank
I
you for
sent
having
out to you.
Thanks for exploring with us, intrepid explorers. If you want more great content, where can they look, Frank?
Well, you could look either, if you're watching on YouTube, it's off to my left, or if you're on Apple Podcasts, we have a whole bunch of stuff listed. This was an expert podcast, so if you're interested in learning more about transmedia and how to create your own story worlds, we have a lot of great content from Houston Howard to Jeff Gomez to Nick Jones talking about transmedia as a topic. Or if you want to explore some cool transmedia projects that are coming out that have their own little bits of Paratext, you can look at our other episodes as well, where we talk to people from around the world.
Like Nick Jones.
Like Nick Jones as well. Yeah, we like Nick Jones here. Thanks for watching.